Welcome to Chapter 10, the Muscular System, Part 2. Now, we're going to learn some different muscles today. The first set of muscles we're going to learn are the muscles involved in breathing. And so they're in the thoracic cavity, or really on the external area of the thoracic cavity. So when we breathe, in fact, in science, that whole process of breathing is titled respiration, right? And so therefore, inspiration means inhaling, and expiration means exhaling. And in order to inhale and exhale, there are muscles that are responsible for this. And in fact, actually, I'll tell you right afterwards. Okay, so let's start with this. Okay, the inspiratory muscles, meaning the muscles that are involved in inhaling, are your diaphragm. Your diaphragm is this large sheet-like muscle that separates the thoracic and abdominal cavities. Okay, then we have muscles called the external intercostal muscles, and their job is to contract and enlarge the rib cage, because take a deep breath right now. Your lungs are expanding with air. Therefore, in turn, your ribs and the muscles around it have to respond, including the diaphragm as well. Okay, now when you exhale and you're blowing your air out, whether it's a small breath or a large breath, you're still going to be using the internal intercostal muscles. So there's 3 total. 2 involved in inhaling, diaphragm, external intercostals, and the expiration, exhaling, is brought about or assisted by internal intercostal muscles. Now, earlier I wanted to say that the diaphragm is such an important muscle that, in fact, any spasm with the diaphragm, or if there's an inability to contract, we can actually die from this. And in fact, a long time ago, the military designed a poison. They didn't design it because it was a bacteria, but they discovered a bacteria, the one that is used in Botox. Okay. And what it does is it paralyzes muscles. That's why it's so useful in cosmetics. Okay, paralyze. It's really hard to write with this. Paralyzes. I'm just going to put M for muscles, okay? Okay, paralyzes muscles. And at first it was designed as biowarfare. So they figured that they could launch it at the enemy, and if it's inhaled and it paralyzes your diaphragm, you can't breathe and you'll die. I'm not sure whether or not they used this. I know it was developed back in the Vietnam War, and eventually somebody realized that if properly manufactured, they can take the bacteria and utilize it to paralyze facial muscles. Thus, we have Botox. All right, that's just kind of some side information. Now let's go ahead and go through the muscles themselves. The first are the external intercostal muscles. Okay, and they originate at the inferior border of the ribs, above it, and the muscle inserts at the superior border of the rib below it. So if you see the muscle highlighted in blue, the origin is up here on each muscle, right? And then the insertion is down here on the rib below it. Okay, and same thing for this muscle. Very good. So their job, their action is they actually end up pulling the ribs towards one another, elevating the rib cage, so bringing it upwards when you are taking that breath, inhaling. The internal intercostal muscles. They have the same origin and insertion, but the muscle is different. Notice how it's thinner and then it goes all the way to the sternum, but it doesn't go all the way around. So that's kind of how I tell the difference between the two. See how thick and big these muscles are, the external ones, and they wrap all the way around to the vertebral column, and they do not touch the sternum. Okay, now the internal ones, they do touch the sternum, and that's how you're going to tell the difference. Okay, and see how they look a little kind of sheet-like, a little thinner. Okay, see, but they're touching the sternum, and they don't go all the way to the vertebrae, to the vertebral column. Okay, so it does have the same, technically the same origin. Okay, the inferior border of the rib above it, and the insertion is the superior border of the rib below it, and its job is to pull ribs towards one another, and in that sense, it's going to depress the rib cage. It's going to aid in expiration, and in fact, it's going to do the exact opposite of the external intercostal muscles. Therefore, it's an antagonist muscle in the breathing process. It reverses what the external intercostal muscles do. Okay, the diaphragm. Now, the diaphragm is here highlighted in blue, and it's this sheet-like, it's a sheet-like muscle. It's very thin, okay, but it's very important when you are breathing. Okay. So this is under here, okay, so this is the thoracic cavity, of course, and the diaphragm separates that from the abdominal cavity, which is down here. Okay, and it's this thin sheet-like muscle, and its job is to contract. So it contracts into a dome-like shape, and then it becomes flat, flat-ish. It flattens on contraction. When it's relaxing, it's like this, and then during contraction, it will flatten out. This is relaxation, this is contraction. Either way, the origin, there's a couple of origins. So the origin for the diaphragm is the inferior internal surface of the entire rib cage and sternum, the costal cartilage. So this cartilage, right, of the last 6 ribs, as well as the lumbar vertebrae. It's a big muscle, so it's going to have to line and originate at quite a few places, and then it's going to insert at this large central tendon here. This is a tendon here in white. Okay, we're going to watch a couple of clips on these muscles and their actions. So let's take a look.
Costals are from the superior borders of the ribs and costal cartilages below. The fibers pass superiorly and anteriorly to insert onto the inferior borders of the ribs and costal cartilages above. The internal intercostals, especially the posterior portion, depress the rib cage during forced expiration. They are innervated by the intercostal nerves.
Yeah, I thought there was one.
The origins of the external intercostals are from the inferior borders of the ribs above. The fibers pass obliquely and inferiorly to insert onto the superior borders of the ribs below. The external intercostals elevate the rib cage during inspiration. They are innervated by the intercostal nerves.
Okay, so they do a good job of showing us how these muscles contract and relax in a three-dimensional form. All right, the next thing that we're going to talk about today are the muscles of the trunk. Okay, so these muscles are pretty interesting, actually. I like them. So these are 4 muscles that make up the muscles of our trunk. So our trunk is that abdominal region and then the sides as well. And basically right below your pecs and down. Okay, so we're going to learn a couple of muscles here. Rectus Abdominis is the first one. Rectus Abdominis. Now, we've been learning about terminology, so I want you to keep these terms in mind, the Latin terminology in mind as we go through. Rectus Abdominis. Okay, think about what that means. What does rectus mean? What does abdominis mean? External oblique muscles. What does oblique mean and external? Internal oblique. What is internal? What is oblique? Transverse abdominis. Okay, so this is where we apply nomenclature. And I'm going to go through each one. They're here in this picture, but I like to talk about them in more detail. So let's go ahead and take a look. The rectus abdominis. Now, remember, what does rectus mean? We talked about this in the previous lecture. Rectus means erect, straight up and down. Abdominis means the abdominal, the abdomen, right? And therefore, there's our rectus abdominis. It's the muscle. It's this muscle right there. And so if someone has a 6-pack or an 8-pack, it's because they work out their rectus abdominis, and it's pretty shredded, right? You can see every single cut in the muscle. And unfortunately, I don't have a stomach like that. It would be nice, right? But either way, oops. Sorry, my thing's jumping around here. Either way, let's take a look. We're in the abdomen, and this is called rectus because look at these fibers. They are perfectly erect, straight up and down. Okay, so your rectus abdominis make up those nice cut ab muscles. They're there, even if you can't see them. All right, now the origin is on the pubic crest and symphysis. Okay, so it's going to be way down here. Okay, and the insertion is going to be way up here at the xiphoid process of the sternum and the costal ribs, 5 through 7. And its job is to flex and rotate your trunk. So flexion of the muscle, rotation of the trunk. All right, and it pulls the pelvis upwards as well. Fantastic. Rectus abdominis. The external abdominal oblique muscles. So this muscle is very straightforward. We said oblique means what? Do you guys remember? Okay, if you said oblique means diagonal, you are correct, my friend. All right, now take a look at the external oblique muscle. There's a small chunk of it here, and notice that they've cut into the muscle to show you the different layers, because our body is three-dimensional and we are teaching it in a two-dimensional form, so it gets a little tricky sometimes. And so they make these great pictures where they cut, you know, the external oblique out so we can see the internal oblique, and then they cut the internal oblique so we can see the transverse. All right, but let's pay attention to the external oblique. So it's on this side and it's on this side. Remember, these muscles come in pairs. So it is indeed running oblique, and it's called external. Why is it called external? Because it is external to the internal oblique and the transverse abdominis. Okay, the origin is the external surface of the lower 8 ribs. So this is quite a large muscle, okay, and it's going to run all the way up, except for this part. This is not part of the muscle. Okay, and of course that's the Pectoralis Major. So this whole thing is the external oblique. It's quite big. All right, now it's going to insert at the Linea Alba. Okay, see this white strip right here? So we don't have a bone in the, or a protective, cage like our ribs to protect the abdominal cavity. We just have these muscles. And the rectus abdominis, the two, see how there's two? They connect right here at the linea alba. It's not a muscle. It's this kind of almost like what's the word I'm looking for? It's almost like a tendon, but not exactly. It's called the linea alba. It's this nice little sheet of thick membrane. Okay, so it holds the two muscles together, and actually lots of muscles of the abdomen are connected to the linea alba, which is this white strip that separates the two rectus abdominis. Now, the iliac crest and the pubic crest. We can't see it here in this picture, but we know where it is. Okay, the action of the external abdominal oblique muscles, they help flex your vertebral column. So flexing your vertebral column is quite important to keep your muscles and your body from getting stiff, right? And then we definitely work out our oblique muscles to keep a nice waistline, okay? And this indeed helps compress your ab walls, and it allows the trunk to rotate and allows for lateral flexion. So that just means that our little side bends that we do at the gym, if you do them, the external obliques are getting worked out. Internal obliques. All right, their origin is at something called the lumbar fascia and the iliac crest, which we know where that is. Actually, the iliac crest is, of course, on the hip bone, and it inserts into the linea alba and the pubic crest. The internal oblique muscles. All right, now their job is to help flex the vertebral column, compress the wall, and rotate and flex laterally the trunk. So its jobs are basically the same as the external obliques, so they just help. But I want you to pay close attention to this. The fibers, they are diagonal, but look which way. They're diagonal this way, right? When the external obliques are coming in this way. And of course, the external is right on top. The transverse abdominis, okay, so they've cut external oblique, internal oblique, and they've cut a piece of the rectus abdominis, and there it is. The transverse abdominis muscle and it runs transverse. See how the fibers run side to side? Transverse, and it's in the abdomen. That's why it's called the transverse abdominis. Okay, it originates the origin. This is a big muscle. It's covered mostly, but it's big. It's going to originate at the last 6 ribs and the iliac crest, inserts at the linea alba, the pubic crest, and it compresses the abdomen. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some clips of these muscles. And then their 3D animation. Obviously, this is the rectus abdominis. I'll just let the little lady talk. All right, here we go.
The origins of the rectus abdominis muscles are from the pubic symphysis and the pubic crests. The insertions are to the xiphoid process of the sternum and the costal cartilages of ribs 5 through 7. The rectus abdominis muscles flex the vertebral column anteriorly. Rectus abdominis muscles also increase intra-abdominal pressure for abdominal breathing as during childbirth. They are innervated by the intercostal nerves. The origins of the external obliques are from ribs 5 through 12. The insertions of the external obliques are to the linea alba via its aponeurosis, the pubic crests and tubercles, and the iliac crests. Acting bilaterally, the external obliques support and compress the abdomen and flex the vertebral column anteriorly. Acting unilaterally, the external oblique laterally flexes and rotates the vertebral column to the opposite side. Due to the compressive effect on the abdomen, the external obliques raise intra-abdominal pressure and assist in forced expiration. They are innervated by the intercostal nerves. The origins of the internal obliques are from the thoracolumbar fascia, the iliac crests, and the inguinal ligaments. The insertions are to the linea alba via a broad aponeurosis, the pubic crests, and ribs 10 through 12. Acting bilaterally, the internal obliques support and compress the abdomen, raise intra-abdominal pressure, and flex the vertebral column anteriorly. Acting unilaterally, the internal oblique laterally flexes and rotates the vertebral column to the same side. Due to the compressive effect on the abdomen, the internal obliques assist in forced expiration. They are innervated by the intercostal nerves.
Okay, the next muscle we're going to talk about is the deltoid muscle. Now, your deltoid is broken into 3 parts. The origin has 2 origins, okay, at the clavicle and the scapula, okay, and it inserts at the humerus bone. This is an unhighlighted deltoid clearly, and then this one is clearly highlighted in blue. Okay, and our deltoid muscle is the main shoulder muscle that we are familiar with, right? And its job is to abduct the arm and shoulder, and it also allows shoulder rotation and flexion.
The deltoid is the large fleshy muscle we most associate with the shoulder complex. It may be separated into 3 groups of fibers: anterior, middle, and posterior. The origin of the anterior fibers is from the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. The insertion is to the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. The anterior fibers move the arm forward from anatomical position, thus flexing the arm at the shoulder. They also medially rotate the arm by turning the anterior surface of the arm toward midline. They are innervated by the axillary nerve. The origin of the middle fibers is from the acromion of the scapula. The insertion is to the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. The middle fibers abduct the arm. They are innervated by the axillary nerve. The origin of the posterior fibers is from the inferior border of the spine of the scapula. The insertion is to the deltoid tuberosity of the humerus. The posterior fibers extend the arm at the shoulder. And laterally rotate the arm by turning the anterior surface of the arm away from midline. They are innervated by the axillary nerve.
Okay, our next muscle is the Pectoralis Major. Now, it should be no surprise that the Pectoralis Major is quite large. This is your primary chest muscle. Okay, and unsurprisingly, there's also a Pectoralis Minor that we will look at. So let's look at the major first. All right. Now notice this origin, or the origin of the Pectoralis Major is quite big. So it starts off over, well, it doesn't necessarily start, but this is part of it. Okay, the clavicle. Okay, the sternum. It goes down pretty far. And then the costal cartilage. And it inserts at the humerus bone. So even though this is a chest muscle, it pulls right into and connects into your humerus near where the deltoid does. Okay, its job, actions. Now, the actions of the Pectoralis Major are associated with your arms, of course, because of that big connection, right? Because of the connection to the humerus. So it flexes, adducts, and rotates your humerus. So why don't we do that now? Flex, adduct, and rotate your humerus back and forth, or pronation, supination. Okay. The Pectoralis Major is involved in those motions. Yes, there are other muscles assisting, but the pec is there too. When you climb, or do pull-ups, for example, you're using these muscles.
The Pectoralis Major is the large superficial muscle of the arm located in the anterior thorax. It may be separated into two groups of fibers, superior or clavicular, and inferior or sternocostal. The origin of the superior or clavicular fibers is from the anterior surface of the medial 1/2 of the clavicle. The insertion is to the lateral lip of the intertubercular groove of the humerus. The origins of the inferior or sternocostal fibers are from the anterior surface of the sternum, the costal cartilages of ribs 1 through 7, and the aponeurosis of the external oblique muscle. The insertion is to the lateral lip of the intertubercular groove of the humerus. Acting as a whole, The key actions of the Pectoralis Major are medial rotation and adduction of the arm. Medial rotation is a movement during which the anterior surface of the arm turns toward midline. Adduction is a movement in a medial direction toward the midsagittal plane. The Pectoralis Major also assists in flexing the arm at the shoulder.
Okay, next muscle, the Pectoralis Minor. The Pectoralis Minor lies right underneath the major, so they've clearly removed that in this image. And the origin are ribs 3, 4, and 5. So 3, 4, 5. And the insertion is going to be at the coracoid process of the scapula up here. Okay, this muscle helps draw the scapula down and forward, and it helps elevate the ribs.
The origins of Pectoralis Minor are from ribs 3 through 5. The insertion is to the coracoid process of the scapula. With the origin fixed, Pectoralis Minor tilts the scapula anteriorly. With the insertion fixed, it draws the rib cage superiorly to aid in forced inspiration. It is innervated by the pectoral nerves.
Serratus Anterior is the next muscle, and we talked about naming muscles, right? And serratus, remember, meant sawtooth. So it's unsurprising that this muscle looks that way. It looks sawtooth. So if you look at this, this is a good picture. There we go, sawtooth. Looks like a fan almost. All right, this is serratus anterior. It originates at the upper 8 ribs and it inserts into the scapula back here. All right, this is an important muscle that helps hold the scapula to the chest wall. It rotates the scapula during abduction and extension of the humerus.
The origins of serratus anterior are from ribs 1 through 8. The insertion is to the costal surface of the medial border of the scapula. Serratus anterior abducts the scapula and laterally rotates the scapula upward by moving the glenoid cavity superiorly and the inferior angle laterally. The superior fibers elevate the scapula, while the inferior fibers depress it. It is innervated by the long thoracic nerve.
The trapezius. The trapezius muscle is quite a large muscle. It's one of the largest ones in the body, and unsurprisingly, it has the kite shape that we discussed, the trapezoid kite shape. Okay, so that's where it gets its name. That's a terrible kite, but we see the kite shape there. Okay, so the origin is at the occipital bone, and from C7 to T12. So it would be halfway down. C7 to T12. Okay, and it inserts in 2 places. It wraps around on the clavicle and the scapula right there. And actually there too. All right. Now, it has a pretty big job. It stabilizes, elevates, retracts, and rotates the scapula.
The trapezius is the large trapezoid-shaped muscle located in the posterior thorax and neck. It may be separated into 3 groups of fibers: superior, middle, and inferior. The origins of the superior fibers are from the external occipital protuberance, the superior nuchal line, the ligamentum nuchae, and the spinous process of vertebrae C7. The insertions are to the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle and acromion of the scapula. With the origin fixed, the superior fibers elevate the scapula, gliding it toward the skull. The superior fibers also laterally rotate the scapula upward. With the insertion fixed and the muscle contracting on one side only, the superior fibers laterally flex and rotate the head and neck to the opposite side. With the insertion fixed and the muscle contracting on both sides, the superior fibers extend the neck. The superior fibers are innervated by the spinal accessory nerve. The origins of the middle fibers are from the spinous processes of vertebrae T1 through T5. The insertions are to the medial border of the acromion and the superior lip of spine of the scapula. With the origin fixed, the middle fibers adduct the scapula. This is a gliding movement toward midline. The middle fibers are innervated by the spinal accessory nerve. The origins of the inferior fibers are from the spinous processes of vertebrae T6 through T12. The insertion is to the tubercle of the spine of the scapula. With the origin fixed, the inferior fibers depress the scapula, gliding it inferiorly. The inferior fibers also laterally rotate the scapula upward. The inferior fibers are innervated by the spinal accessory nerve.
All right, next muscle, levator scapula. All right, so that's highlighted here in blue. They look like little strips, right? So it's one muscle. The origin is at the C1 through C4, and the insertion is at the scapula. All right, its job is to elevate and adduct the scapula. So all of these muscles work in tandem to achieve certain goals.
The origins of levator scapula are from the transverse processes of cervical vertebrae 1 through 4. The insertion is to the upper 1/3 of the medial border of the scapula. Levator scapula elevates the scapula and pulls the glenoid cavity inferiorly. It is innervated by the cervical nerves and the dorsal scapular nerve.
Okay, next muscle, the rhomboid major. The rhomboid major is this thick, short muscle that lies in between your spinal cord and your scapula. Here it's highlighted in blue, and the origin is at the spinous process of T2 to T5. So that's the origin, and it's going to insert at the scapula, and it stabilizes that bone and keeps it in place. And of course, it has a partner on the other side as well.
The origins of rhomboid major are from the spinous processes of vertebrae T2 through T5. The insertion is to the medial border of the scapula. Rhomboid Major elevates the scapula, adducts the scapula, and medially rotates the scapula downward by moving the glenoid cavity inferiorly and the inferior angle medially. It is innervated by the dorsal scapular nerve.
And then, of course, we have right above it the rhomboid minor, which is significantly smaller than the major. And its origin is at the spinous process of C7 to T1, inserting at the scapula, and it works with the rhomboid major to stabilize the scapula. Rhomboid minor. Let's take a look.
The origins of rhomboid minor are from the ligamentum nuchae and the spinous processes of vertebrae C7 and T1. The insertion is to the medial border of the scapula. Rhomboid minor elevates the scapula, adducts the scapula, and medially rotates the scapula downward by moving the glenoid cavity inferiorly and the inferior angle medially. It is innervated by the dorsal scapular nerve.
There are 4 muscles that comprise the posterior group: the Levator Scapulae, the Rhomboid Minor, the Rhomboid Major, and the Trapezius. The Levator Scapulae muscle originates on the transverse processes of vertebrae C1 through C4 and inserts on the medial border of the scapula just superior to the spine of the scapula. The Rhomboid Minor muscle originates on the spinous processes of vertebrae C7 through T1 and inserts on the medial border of the scapula at the level of the spine of the scapula. The Rhomboid Major muscle originates on the spinous processes of thoracic vertebrae 2 through 5 and inserts on the medial border of the scapula inferior to the spine of the scapula. The trapezius muscle originates on the external occipital protuberance, the medial 1/3 of the superior nuchal line, and the spinous processes of vertebrae C7 through T12. Insertion of the trapezius muscle makes a continuous line from the acromion and spine of the scapula to the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle.
Okay, so the next muscle we're going to look at is the Latissimus Dorsi, and yes, all of these details are necessary, including the videos. The Latissimus Dorsi is quite a big muscle, and I'm going to just go into the video and then come back. Oh, I thought I could do that. Okay, never mind. Well, let's take a look at this muscle. This muscle is the one that just wraps all the way around your back. It is the biggest muscle in the body. Okay, now the origin is at the spinous process of the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae. Okay, the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae means 6 through 12, right? And the lower 3 to 4 ribs. Now remember, ribs wrap all the way around, so it's not completely surprising to have that origin on the lower ribs and the vertebrae, because ribs they conjoin with the vertebrae on the opposite side, especially the thoracic vertebrae. Okay, and then the insertion, it's hard to see it in this, and I am going to find you a great video. I think I have one somewhere, but it inserts on the humerus, and it's one of the prime movers of the arm for extension, adduction, and it allows you to medially rotate your arm. Medial meaning inwards towards the midline. Okay. The next muscle is called the subscapularis. It's here in blue, and then on this side it's not highlighted, but you see how it lays against the scapula from the inside of the scapula. And so its origin is that subscapular fossa. So that space, that groove, or it's a fossa, that space, that flat space in the scapula. And it inserts at the lesser tubercle of the humerus. And its action is it's one of the prime movers of the arm. It rotates the arm medially as well. All right, let's take a look.
The origin of Subscapularis is from the subscapular fossa of the scapula. The insertion is to the lesser tubercle of the humerus. Subscapularis medially rotates the arm, and along with all other rotator cuff muscles, it stabilizes the shoulder joint. It is innervated by the subscapular nerves.
Okay, supraspinatus. This is a great picture. Think of supra, meaning above, spine. Spine. We're talking about the spine of the scapula, right? And so it's laying right here in blue, and then on this side you can see it over here. Okay, so the origin is the subscapular fossa of the scapula, and then it inserts at the greater tubercle of the humerus. Its job is to initiate abduction of the arm. Supraspinatus. This is another picture of the supraspinatus.
The origin of supraspinatus is from the supraspinous fossa of the scapula. The insertion is to the greater tubercle of the humerus. Supraspinatus abducts the arm. Along with the other rotator cuff muscles, supraspinatus stabilizes the shoulder joint. It is innervated by the suprascapular nerve.
The infraspinatus. So we just saw the supraspinatus, which means that it's superior to the spine of the scapula. This one is the infraspinatus. So see that spine right there? The infraspinatus is right underneath, and its origin is on the infraspinous fossa of the scapula. Okay, it inserts into the greater tubercle of the humerus, and it allows us to rotate the arm laterally.
The origin of infraspinatus is from the infraspinous fossa of the scapula. The insertion is to the greater tubercle of the humerus and the capsule of the shoulder joint. Infraspinatus laterally rotates the arm by turning the anterior surface away from midline, and along with the other rotator cuff muscles, it stabilizes the shoulder joint. It is innervated by the suprascapular nerve.
Okay, next muscle is the Teres Major. All right, now the Teres Major is a pretty important muscle. It's clearly very short, and it's going to connect our scapula with the humerus, such as the other bones, but it's a little bit different because it's not laying completely on the surface of the scapula. There's just part of it that is on the posterior surface of the scapula at the inferior angle. So its origin is quite small, actually, in comparison to these guys that, lay completely into the fossa, and it's going to insert at the lesser tubercle of the humerus bone. This muscle allows us to extend the arm, medially rotate the arm, and adduct the arm. Let's take a look at that one.
The origin of Teres Major is from the posterior surface of the inferior angle and lower 1/3 of the lateral border of the scapula. The fibers run superiorly and laterally to insert onto the medial lip of the intertubercular groove of the humerus. Teres Major adducts the arm, medially rotates the arm, and extends the arm. It is innervated by the lower subscapular nerve.
Okay, so unsurprisingly, there's a Teres Minor right there. Okay, so the major's right here. The minor's above it, and it originates at the lateral border of the scapula. So the Teres Major's over here, right? Okay, and then the minor originates right there, and it inserts at the greater tubercle of the humerus, and it allows us to extend, medially rotate, and adduct the arm. The teres major and minor are going to work together in tandem to execute the same action.
The origin of teres minor is from the posterior surface of the lateral border of the scapula. The insertion is to the greater tubercle of the humerus. Teres minor adducts and laterally rotates the arm. Along with the other rotator cuff muscles, teres minor stabilizes the shoulder joint. It is innervated by the axillary nerve.
Okay, our next muscle is the Biceps Brachii. Now, we've talked about this muscle before, so it's a little exciting to finally study it, right? Okay, and we're going to start with the two origins. So we have a short head and a long head. So the short head is going to originate at the coracoid process, and the long head will come from the supraglenoid cavity. Okay, I'm sorry, the supraglenoid tubercle and lip of the glenoid cavity. Now, this part runs into the joint capsule and into the humerus, and both will insert on the radius at the radial tuberosity. It's responsible for flexing and supination of the forearm. And let's take a look at the video.
Biceps brachii is the large two-headed flexor muscle located in the anterior compartment of the arm. The origin of the long head is from the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. The origin of the short head is from the tip of the coracoid process of the scapula. The two heads insert by a common tendon onto the radial tuberosity and by the bicipital aponeurosis, which blends with the deep fascia on the medial aspect of the forearm. Biceps brachii flexes the forearm at the elbow supinates the forearm, and weakly flexes the shoulder. It is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve.
Okay, next muscle, the Tricep Brachii. And remember, tri means three, sept means head, and brachii is in reference to the upper arm. Okay, Tricep Brachii. Tri means that it has three heads: long, lateral, medial. The long head is going to originate from the infraglenoid tubercle, the lateral from the shaft of the humerus, and the medial from the posterior shaft of the humerus, but a little distal to the radial groove. And all three heads will insert together at the ulna, and it's a forearm extensor, so it allows you to extend your arm. Let's take a look.
Triceps brachii is the large extensor muscle located in the posterior compartment of the arm. It has three heads of origin: the long head, the lateral head, and the medial head. The origin of the long head is from the infraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. The origins of the lateral head are from the posterior and lateral surfaces of the superior one-half of the humerus. It is located both superiorly and laterally to the radial groove. The origins of the medial head are from the inferior two-thirds of the medial and posterior surfaces of the humerus and is located inferiorly to the radial groove. Together, the three heads insert onto the superior and posterior surfaces of the olecranon process of the ulna. Triceps brachii extends the forearm at the elbow. It is innervated by the radial nerve.
All right, next muscle. Okay, these are clearly muscles of the forearm. This one is called brachialis. Okay, brachialis is an interesting muscle because it has a huge role and it's so unknown. And it's one of the major muscles in the forearm. It originates at the anterior surface of the humerus, the distal end of the humerus, and inserts at the coronoid process of the ulna and the capsule of the elbow joint. So origin, insertion, and it allows flexion of the forearm.
The origin of brachialis is from the distal one-half of the anterior surface of the humerus and adjacent intermuscular septa. The insertion is to the tuberosity and coronoid process of the ulna. Brachialis flexes the forearm at the elbow. It is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve and a small branch of the radial nerve.
Okay, brachioradialis. Brachioradialis originates at the lateral supracondyle ridge at the distal end of the humerus, so that's up here. Okay, and it's going to wrap around and insert at the base of the radial styloid process way down here. Now, the brachioradialis is a synergistic muscle in flexing the forearm. All right, let's take a look at this one.
The origin of brachioradialis is from the lateral supracondylar ridge of the humerus. The insertion is to the base of the styloid process of the radius. Brachioradialis is an especially strong forearm flexor when the forearm is in a semi-pronated position. It is innervated by the deep radial nerve.
All right, next muscle. It's quite small. It's called the pronator teres muscle. And it originates on the humerus, specifically the medial epicondyle of the humerus. And it also originates on the coronoid process of the ulna. It'll wrap around and insert at the radius. It allows you to pronate your forearm, which means to turn the forearm. All right, now these are the last muscles of the arm that I'm going to discuss. There's more muscles in the arm, but this is the last one that we're going to talk about in this class. This one is called the flexor carpi radialis. The origin is at the humerus, at the medial epicondyle, and the ulna, at the coronoid process of the ulna. And it wraps all the way down and inserts at the metacarpals. And it's a flexor of your hands.
Flexor carpi radialis is one of the superficial flexor muscles occupying the anterior compartment of the forearm. The origin of flexor carpi radialis is from the common flexor tendon of the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The insertions are to the base of metacarpal 2 and by a tendinous slip to the base of metacarpal 3. Flexor carpi radialis flexes and abducts the wrist. It is innervated by the median nerve.
Oh, I lied. There's one more. The flexor digitorum superficialis, and this is the last one. This one's really important because of the fact that it runs into the digits, and so it originates at the humerus, the epicondyle, the medial epicondyle, and the coronoid process of the ulna, and part of the radius, right there. Okay, and then it's going to insert into phalanges 2 through 5, and it flexes the hands and your phalanges 2 through 5. So basically your fingers, everything aside from the thumb, which has its own muscle. Let's take a look.
Flexor digitorum superficialis is one of the superficial flexor muscles occupying the anterior compartment of the forearm. Flexor digitorum superficialis has 3 heads: the humeral head, the ulnar head, and the radial head. The origin of the humeral head is from the common flexor tendon of the medial epicondyle of the humerus. The origin of the ulnar head is from the medial side of the coronoid process of the ulna. The origin of the radial head is from the oblique line of the radius. The insertion is by 4 tendons to the middle phalanges of digits 2 through 5. Flexor digitorum superficialis flexes the proximal interphalangeal joints of digits 2 through 5. It assists in flexion of the metacarpophalangeal joints and in flexion of the wrist. It is innervated by the median nerve.
All of the tendons of the long flexor muscles are held in place at the wrist.
And these are all hand and wrist muscles.
By a thickening of the deep fascia called the flexor retinaculum. Consequently, this creates a tight space through which the tendons must pass prior to reaching their sites of insertion called the carpal tunnel. To allow for movement within the carpal tunnel, each tendon is enclosed in a sheath that enables it to slide back and forth. Still, this region is very susceptible to painful inflammation called carpal tunnel syndrome.